there! Welcome to my bathroom. A trans in the bathroom. It honestly feels nice to be in here. You know, people were trying to keep transes out of the bathroom for so long, I began to wonder if there was a missing part of the title to that well-known children's book. Like, everybody poops, except the transes. Oh boy, we're going with scatological humor for this video. I promise you, if you're a new viewer to this channel, that we are certainly much more highbrow here than that. And if you're a longtime viewer, don't tell the new folks that this is the highbrow. But I'm sure you all remember a few years ago those bathroom bills that became popular with many conservative groups in the United States and the United Kingdom. Attempts to regulate folks to use the public bathroom assigned with their sex on their birth certificate. Because what if a man tried to pretend to be trans and tried to enter the bathroom to assault a woman, or, as these bills were often targeted at the public school system, towards students? Think of the children, think of our little girls. Never mind that there were literally few to no documented cases of that actually happening. The fact that who the hell would actually enforce something like that, a bouncer at the bathroom door checking birth certificates? Or the fact that assaulting someone in any bathroom anywhere was already illegal anyways, so it's not as if it's going to be a preventative measure, and you know, a myriad of other reasons. This isn't even to mention the fact that those laws did exactly the opposite for children, considering it would have forced transgender folks, teens or adults, into bathrooms that didn't match their gender identity and potentially put them at great risk of assault themselves, as well as stigmatizing transgender people at a time when 76% of transgender students felt unsafe at school, and still do, by the way, because of their gender identity. Not to mention the fact that many LGBTQ students would perform worse in schools due to increased rates of discrimination against them in those school systems. But you see, all those reasons were irrelevant because while these bills may not have actually said this in the letter of the bills, those laws were clearly just meant to be targeted bills to regulate and fearmonger about trans people, often used by political groups to create fear around a marginalized group like trans people that many people don't know directly and could easily be scapegoated in order to galvanize voters to the polls. Now, obviously, many of these bills, though not all, failed to get traction due to the hard work to inform and educate many lawmakers and voters by activists throughout both the United States and United Kingdom about why these bathroom bills were misinformative and harmful. But of course, like Jeff Goldblum always told us, fear-mongering always finds a way. Always finds a way to make you worry about the erosion of family values. That means you just must vote conservatives who totally care about you and just totally aren't there for your money and the power that they can wield. I say that because there has been a new trend that has taken once again the form of anti-transgender legislation in both the United States and United Kingdom. And this type of new legislation is again trying to make people worry about the danger of the trans agenda on women and especially the children.
Somebody please think of the children!
And the in vogue theme this year is prohibiting transgender minors from taking any medical action in regard to their gender identity because it's child abuse. And these laws have mainly been focusing on the transition of minors who are transgender men, which advocates of these anti-transgender laws describe as young girls who have been led into the trans agenda, tricked into getting irreversible medical procedures before they are old enough to understand what they're going through. And when I say trend, I mean it's hotter than the new, I don't know, I don't follow pop culture, Billie Eilish album? Billie Eilish has a new album, right? Stick to your wheelhouse, Jessie. These bills are more common than the Klingon fighting for honor, because at the time of this video's filming, there are at least 12 states in the US putting forth these bills, like Texas's House Bill 68, which would categorize as abuse, quote,
acts by a medical professional or mental health professional for the purpose of attempting to change or affirm a child's perception of the child's sex, if that perception is inconsistent with the child's biological sex as determined by the child's sex organs, chromosomes, and endogenous hormone profiles.
Endogenous? Endogenous? Erogenous? Don't know what that word is. Such acts would include medications for puberty blockers, for example. In the United Kingdom, a similar legal battle had similar results, where a British High Court ruled in the case of Bell v. Tavistock that transgender minors would be, quote, highly unlikely to be able to consent to transgender treatment, even if their parents approved, and thus effectively put a ban on transgender treatments for minors in the entire United Kingdom until, at the very least, the case goes through appeals, and even then it still may be upheld at that point. So clearly these bills are gaining traction, and to be honest with you, I kind of understand why. I know I've already framed these bills as anti-transgender because I believe that's what they are, and I know that for many of you watching this video, that confirms my bias against these bills, especially considering the fact that I am trans. But being honest with you, let me tell you, I understand why the issues that these bills address feel like very real dangers, especially for parents, family members, and loved ones of minors who may wish to transition at a young age. Now obviously, as I said, I'm transgender, but when I came out at the age of 21, my younger sister, who was 15 at the time, started to explore her own gender identity and thought that she was trans too, and even spoke to me about seeking medical intervention as a result. Now, as many of you can tell by the fact that I'm using she/her pronouns for her, she currently doesn't identify as trans anymore, at least to my knowledge. So even within my own family, I can tell you that the exploration of young folks around gender may lead them to seek medical interventions for gender identity related issues that may not end up aligning with what they actually come to understand about themselves later on in life. And I love my sister with all of my heart, and I wouldn't want her to harm herself or do something irreversible that she would later regret in life when it could have been prevented, especially if there was maybe the possibility that she had been influenced to make those decisions by me coming out as transgender, even if I didn't intentionally try to influence her that way. So I totally understand very, very personally the fear that family members feel about a child that may be unduly influenced by the trans agenda and may experience long-lasting harm because of it. So if you are someone who came to this video who was on the fence about these laws or is actively supportive of these laws and wanted to hear another person's perspective on them, let me tell you right up front that I completely understand why you may think that these laws are actually beneficial or helpful or necessary. I really, really do. But I still believe that these bills and laws are fear-mongering and directly harmful to transgender people, specifically harmful to transgender minors, but all transgender folks. So let's break down why I think that actually is. And hey, while we're here in the bathroom for a while, let's do a time-honored bathroom tradition. We should get some reading done while we're here on the toilet. Let me see what we got here. We got this book. Yeah, sorry, we're gonna be here for a while, and this book's a little bit too short. Highly recommend it though, but sorry, Marks. Next time. Instead, let's take a look at this book. Yes, Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. Yeah, this book. You may have heard of this book. For one, it's the book that frames most of the arguments used to argue for bills like the ones I've been talking about throughout the United States and the United Kingdom. That young teens are being tricked into irreversible transgender surgeries. Also, many transgender folks have called out this book specifically as one of the most transphobic books to be given a wide release. And I bet many of you are asking, why would we want to read such a book? Well, it's actually because I wanted to take time to read the book, despite me knowing that it's actually intensely transphobic and that I wouldn't at all be particularly surprised by its contents. So I wanted to let you know that I actually bought the book, I have read it, I have seen the arguments that are in this book. I even like, look. I took notes. There are notes here. I read it. I put notes in the book. But seriously, despite my very specific problems about this book, I think it's worthwhile to take a look at why I think that this book is so persuasive in some of its arguments, and why some people may even be convinced by some of the things that this book says, despite the fact that I do believe that this book is incredibly, incredibly harmful and directly transphobic, and I'll get into that part of it as well. Because Abigail's arguments are, like I said, the same basic arguments used by proponents for these types of bills. That's the express goal of this book. As Shrier says right in her intro in this book,
some small portion of the population will always be transgender, but perhaps the current craze will not always lure troubled young girls with no history of gender dysphoria, enlarging them in a lifetime of hormone dependency and disfiguring surgeries. If this is a social contagion, society perhaps can arrest it.
So, let's use this book as a guide for our discussion about these types of laws. Much of what Abigail's arguments are based on the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. As Abigail puts it right here in the book,
the Western world has seen a sudden surge of adolescents claiming to have gender dysphoria and self-identifying as transgender. For the first time in medical history, natal girls are not only present among those identifying, they constitute the majority.
The idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria originated in July 2016 on 3 online blogs. Now, all of these blogs had a history of anti-transgender propaganda. These blogs propagated the idea that teens were more and more likely to come out as transgender today, now with the growing visibility of transgender people, as well as the encouragement by pop culture, news media, doctors, and influencers such as myself to encourage people to want to become transgender. Now, we'll talk about that, pop culture influence later on, but according to this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, this is an entirely new phenomenon, with many trans teens suddenly deciding to be trans without any prior hints to the fact of that in their life. That gender dysphoria just happens because of societal influences and the trans agenda. Now, I cited that this idea came about from anti-transgender blogs, but I certainly understand why it would make sense to anybody even if they don't have that sort of leaning bias with them. But diving into the idea even more, many psychologists working with transgender teens point out that many adolescents and adults presenting with gender dysphoria do not report a history of childhood gender nonconforming behaviors.
Late onset gender dysphoria occurs around puberty or much later in life. Some of these individuals report having had a desire to be of the other gender in childhood that was not expressed verbally to others. Others do not recall any signs of childhood gender dysphoria. For adolescent males with late onset gender dysphoria, parents often report surprise because they did not see signs of gender dysphoria during childhood.
So, as we can see, the idea that suddenly people are deciding to be trans despite there being no evidence previous in their life is not really supported by the direct experience by those working with transgender teens, and much of the research supports that. However, if we take a look at the larger population, is there a larger amount of people coming out as transgender? Well, the one idea that supports the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria that was done by Lisa Lightman stated that transgender children were coming out an alarming 4,400% more than in previous years when the study was done. But the methodology behind the study was incredibly flawed, as noted by the Journal of Adolescent Health, who peer-reviewed the study.
For starters, this was not a study of the children themselves, but rather their parents, who were instructed to fill out a 90-question survey about their adolescent and young adult children. What's even more troubling is how this sample set of parents was selected. Recruitment information with a link to the survey was placed on 3 websites where parents and professionals have been observed to describe rapid onset of gender dysphoria. In other words, this supposed study of ROGD is entirely based on the opinions of parents who frequent the very same 3 blogs that invented and vociferously promote the concept of ROGD. Frankly, this is the most blatant example of begging the question that I have ever seen in a research paper.
So we can see that the science behind rapid onset gender dysphoria is only supported by people who were looking to prove that rapid onset gender dysphoria was a thing. There is actually no evidence that people are coming out in hugely larger numbers than ever before. Now, it may seem like that because, again, there's more visibility, again, confirmation bias, and I would even go so far as to say that there might be a larger influence of transgender people coming out as trans. Abigail herself somewhat addresses this in her book. Trans influencers, hey, that's me.
Trans influencers typically promote trans as a lifestyle to celebrate, not the result of a malady they hope to cure. No longer the engine of transgender identity, gender dysphoria becomes the caboose, dragged along like so much useless iron or detached and set free. The important thing is the social identity, not any diagnosis. Misunderstood this way, trans is something you might want to become even if you aren't suffering gender dysphoria.
Suffering gender dysphoria.
Basically, Schreier is arguing that transgender influences like myself and, actual other more important people promote a transgender idea as something cool. Come on now, all the cool kids are being trans now, you want to be like us, you want to be like one of the cool cats. I do think that being trans is pretty cool. I'm not. I'm kind of a giant dork. Have you seen my channel? But many trans folks are pretty awesome. I'm looking at you, Vera Wild. But I'm not trying to convince anyone that I'm trans, nor is any other transgender influencer. What many of us do say, though, is that people should be more willing to explore their identity, but only in so much as what's comfortable for you. We're not saying that you need to become trans, but that there should be more exploration and pushing the boundaries of what gender identity is and what you feel comfortable with. Society tells many people that they have to be one way, that men need to be closed off, that they can't be super emotional. But is that actually true? No, I think that we should be pushing that boundary more and more. And the influence of transgender people might be because these boundaries have slipped a little bit more in our society, that we are talking about it. And so many trans people, because there's more visibility, feel more comfortable coming out than ever before at this point in our society. That because there are more people talking about what it means to be trans, that trans people that always existed and that would have existed regardless of anything feel more comfortable as coming out. What's more, trans influencers like myself, if I can go so far as to call myself an influencer, do focus on the positives of being trans, not gender dysphoria, for a few reasons. One, being transgender does not require gender dysphoria, which by the way is the feeling of distress one gets at their body not aligning with their gender identity. You know, you feel like you don't feel comfortable in your body because it doesn't align with your gender identity, and so you experience depression or possible suicidal thoughts or just general upsetness at the fact that you don't feel comfortable in your own body. And a lot of trans people do experience gender dysphoria, but gender dysphoria is something that can be treated or helped alleviated through things like hormones, surgeries, and or therapy. And some people want to have some of those, all of those, none of those. Some people just want hormones or surgery for the example, or maybe they just at their most basic want to be able to wear a dress in public or wear more makeup to help alleviate that dysphoria. Or maybe they just want to use she, her pronouns or he, him pronouns or they, her pronouns. Whatever pronouns that they wish to use just to feel comfortable. It could be something as simple as that or something as big as getting a bunch of surgeries that you need to feel more comfortable in how you present in the world. But beyond that though, some trans people feel no dysphoria at all. Maybe they feel euphoria at being affirmed. Maybe they feel happy whenever they feel those things, like when they get surgery or people use she, her pronouns for them. It's not technically a medical issue because medical issues are something that cause you distress. So if you experience no distress but only happiness, then why not just pursue something in your life that makes you happy? But you don't necessarily need to treat it as a medical issue, as something to be medicalized. Maybe someone doesn't mind wearing guys' clothing, for example, but it gets really happy when they're wearing girls' clothing. They aren't depressed either way, but they are happy to wear a dress. And some trans folks just feel more comfortable being addressed or appearing a certain way. And who are we to tell them that they can't take steps to make themselves more comfortable? We shouldn't be telling people how to live their lives and how to be comfortable in their own bodies. For example, if we let a cis, i.e. a non-transgender woman, get a boob job to feel happier in her body, to feel more comfortable with the size of her boobs, why can't a trans woman do the same? So we don't want to focus only on the medicalization of being trans because it frames trans as something simply to be cured, something to be treated, when it's not necessarily exclusively a medical issue. Secondly though, trans people are told over and over and over again by society that we are less than, that we are somehow less normal or even subhuman. And this can lead to many mental health issues for trans people. Now, being trans doesn't necessarily mean that you are depressed, but having to live a lifetime of being discriminated against, insulted, ostracized by your family and friends or people on the street can lead some people to being suicidal, depressed, or face mental health issues. And I've done tons of videos on that specific topic, so I won't go over it too much here, but the reason so many trans creators and activists talk about the joy of being trans is because we need a place to feel okay and be told we're okay, and it's good to actually be ourselves, that we aren't bad for being trans, that we aren't worse as human beings for being trans. It's why we have Pride celebrations in the LGBTQ community. It's just a few days of the year to remind ourselves that we are just as beautiful as any other human being, despite the fact that society may tell us differently. Now, all that being said, I would say that there is probably more visibility, like I said before, of transgender teens that exists due to the fact that trans visibility as a whole has increased. And also topics like these bills raise forth these issues more and more in our general discussion. And I would say that we currently live in a world where gender norms are being pushed more and more. Young girls and boys are encouraged to explore more aspects of their gender that had previously been considered off limits. Boys are encouraged to be less guarded with their emotions, girls more assertive. And it's certainly understandable if that exploration of gender leads some teens to at least question their comfortability with their own gender identity. Now, I'm not saying that these teens that have come out as transgender all end up being believing that they're transgender when they become adults, but I would say that that exploration, that trying on of that label, is part of maybe a teen's experience who is exploring their gender identity. Being a kid is about trying on new identities and figuring out who you are. So I would guess that there would be more teens coming out as transgender, or at least exploring that label. But a sudden crazy downpouring of trans people like it's rain in transes, there's zero evidence of this. But Even if that's true, even if there wasn't a sudden rash of cases of trans teens, I still understand why people will be supportive of these bills. We should still want to protect transgender teens who do come out, right? I mean, even if one child gets protected under these laws from going through a procedure that they would later regret and cause them depression later on in life, isn't that worthwhile? Again, I totally understand that viewpoint. I completely get it. But you see, most of these laws tend to frame how transgender teens are treated incredibly disingenuously. Many of these laws tend to frame all transgender surgeries as one lump package that we try to sell to trans kids. The Texas law I mentioned before, for example, beyond just puberty blockers, also wishes to outlaw, quote,
surgery that sterilizes the child, including castration, vasectomy, hysterectomy, oophorectomy, metoidioplasty, orchiectomy, penectomy, phalloplasty, and vaginoplasty.
As Abigail puts in her book, quote,
the dangers are legion, the safeguards absent. Perhaps the greatest risk of all for adolescent girls who grasp at this transgender identity out of the blue, like it is the inflatable ring she hopes will save her, will wake up one morning with no breasts and no uterus and think, I was only 16 at the time. A kid. Why didn't anyone?
Dear God, we need to protect teens from that. Like, they're talking about surgeries like castration and sterilization. Abigail herself makes it sound like a horror movie that a young girl wakes up from a living nightmare to find her body horribly and permanently disfigured. But you see, few, if anyone, is actually arguing that transgender teens should have those surgeries, at least not until they can make informed consent as an adult. The thing that most transgender teens and parents seek out are puberty blockers, drugs that stop the irreversible effects of puberty on their bodies. By taking this drug, it allows them longer time to come to terms with their own gender identity and decide later on in life to transition when they can give consent to have more definitive actions like surgeries. It just pauses puberty, and if they decide later on that their gender identity assigned at birth is what they want to be, they can just stop the puberty blockers and have a puberty a little bit later in life than they normally would. And yeah, that may seem like a bad thing, like, oh, they'll go through puberty a little bit later in life, but dear God, I wish I could have had puberty at 18 instead of 15, even beyond all the trans crap I was going through. I mean, I didn't want to be a constantly horny teenager. Do you know how hard it is to concentrate in high school math class when you're a hormonal teen? All those sexy, sexy numbers. But anyways, puberty blockers are 100% reversible, where, by the way, the effects of puberty are not. I personally went through a normal puberty for my biological sex. I didn't go on puberty blockers, and because of that, there are certain aspects of my physical body that caused me a lot of discomfort because of the irreversible effects that I had going through a boy's puberty. I, have broader shoulders than I probably would have if I had, taken puberty blockers when I was a younger kid. And honestly, that still incredibly bothers me today. It bothers me that I have broader shoulders. I'm just sharing you one of my insecurities. It's not a bad thing about me. It doesn't make me gross or ugly, but it is something that I personally get a little bit of distress from because I went through a normal puberty that I could have stopped had I been going on puberty blockers. It would have been something that as an adult I would be less worried about nowadays if I had had that opportunity. And as a study by the Massachusetts General Hospital found, 90% of transgender adults who were denied these puberty blockers faced suicidal ideation in their lifetime because they had to go through puberty, a horrible experience for trans people. That's something that I went through too. Puberty was a horrible, horrible time for me personally because I did have gender dysphoria. And so going through puberty and feel these changes in my body that I did not want caused me a lot of depression. And I would love for any trans teen to not have to experience that, to not have to go through that. And there is a way for them to do it with puberty blocking drugs that are, again, 100% reversible. It greatly increases the chance for trans men and women and non-binary folks to avoid that outcome that I went through and decide if they want to go through a normal puberty later on in life or take hormones or have more surgeries when they are older when they can consent to such things. Also, throughout the book, Abigail will often use horrific descriptions of folks who detransition in order to prove her point. To say that detransitioning is a horrible experience for trans people who were tricked into going through these surgeries at a young age. She described their bodies as mutilated. The detransitioners going through depression when they realized that they made a huge mistake earlier in life. I also do have sympathy for folks who do detransition, and it causes them a lot of pain. But to hyper-focus on these stories and describe them in disgusting detail wields these unfortunate stories as bludgeons, using gory language to galvanize empathy for her position against transgender treatment. Certainly, detransition does happen, and that needs to be discussed. We do want to help detransitioners when they go through such a horrible experience. But to give you a clear idea, only 2.2% of people who transition experience regret. 2.2%. That's less than the 16% of people who regret getting more commonplace surgeries like facelifts or boob jobs and things like that. And we don't outlaw those surgeries despite it having a larger impact on the population. It's 2.2% of the transgender population who transition. And by the way, transgender people make up about less than 1% of the overall world population. So we are talking about 2.2% of less than 1%. That's like a very, very small percent. Definitely not a sexy number. And like I said, I won't go into this in much for the detail because again, like I said, I've done a whole video on detransitioners and how we should feel both sympathy for them, how we can help them, but how to stop their stories from being co-opted by people like Abigail. So again, to reiterate, people who wish to provide transgender teens with medical assets aren't trying to offer them irreversible surgeries before they've had time to truly explore their sense of identity. Only provide them with puberty blockers that just allow them to have more time to make an informed decision when they are 18 years old or whatever the region's area is for informed consent of such irreversible surgeries, and allow them to explore their identity without having to go through puberty, itself an irreversible body-changing event that can lead to suicidal thoughts and experiences for many trans teens on its own. And for many places in the United States, someone can't even get a surgery without being on hormones for a year, which you can't get on anyways until you're 16 or 18 depending on where you are, as well as having the recommendation of at least one, often two therapists. Not to mention insurance that covers it or enough money to pay for the surgery, but the economics of transgender transitions are their entire own conversation. But you see, by lumping all these transgender surgeries together into one bill, it makes it seem like the scary transgender agenda wants to make your transgender teen go through these scary, irreversible surgeries. You need to go through it to prove your transness. And that's not the case. As I said before, trans people may want to have all these surgeries or none of them. They need a chance to explore that and figure that out for themselves. And as I spoke about before with my own sister who went through this, that's what I encouraged her to do. That's what I wanted her to do. Even though I myself came out as trans and knew that getting certain surgeries was right for me, I wanted my sister just to have a chance to explore her own identity. So I asked her to try on new clothes, maybe try using he, him pronouns, try wearing guys' clothing, try presenting more masculinely around friends or with people that she felt safe with. Just allow her that chance to explore herself. But I advocated to her and to my stepmother, who was my sister's actual mother, that she should not actually have irreversible steps taken like hormones and surgery, because I wanted her to be able to make that decision when she was able to consent. And guess what? That's what she did. When she was old enough, she decided that she did not actually want to transition in any significant way, and while she does still play with gender here and there in her life, she generally settles down upon a female presentation and female gender identity. And that's totally fine, and I'm glad that she got the chance to explore that and know that about herself. Because now that she had that chance to play with her identity as a little kid, she now knows about herself what makes her comfortable. We need to allow people to explore the range of options that they have within their own identity, especially when they're young and have that time to do so, in order so that when they are adults, they don't question or worry or reconsider or have regrets about decisions that they made when they were younger in life. It's an important part of being a child, is exploring identity, so why are we not allowing people the best possible chance to do so? And so, by supporting these bills, it's supporting bills that actually not only harm transgender teens, but all teens who may not get the chance to learn that they aren't transgender when they get older. And it can cause a ton of harm, and also all the stuff that I talked about with the bathroom bills, the increased discrimination, stigmatizing transgender people, making transgender people seen as less than or different or weird or harmful or actively harmful because we are considered to be coercing young trans teens with our transgender agenda. All that stigmatization can lead trans people to, again, face larger amounts of depression, suicide ideation, and mental health issues just on the fact that we are further stigmatized within laws on our society that then encourage people in daily life to believe misinformation and harmful misinformation about us. So overall, these bills are just terrible. So to disingenuously frame that as what transgender people want for everybody, that we want everybody to have surgeries and go through every single type of transition, is just dangerously misinformed at best and predatory at worst. But that's a basic summary of the main arguments for these bills, all ones that I can take on good faith even if I disagree with them. But Abigail's arguments and the arguments of many go deeper into rhetorical tricks and disingenuous fear-mongering and bigotry in order to try to pass these types of laws and ideas. And let me say this right here, this book is quite literally the shittiest thing I have ever read. And I'm in a bathroom right now, so I know some shit. And look, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm trying very hard on this channel, not only in this video, but to every single issue that I try to look at, to give everyone a benefit of the doubt, to try and see all sides of the issue. I tried my best in this video to show as much deference to people who are actually worried about their children, who may think that they're going to come out as transgender and may regret that later on. And I totally understand that fear. I understand that because it comes from a very real place that I had in my life. But I also know that those fears are being created, manipulated, and influenced by people like Abigail and books and arguments like the ones that are within this book. And the way the books like this discuss transgender people is disgusting and horrible. Now, I've already said that the framing is disingenuous. No one argues for minors to get irreversible surgeries until they are adults who can make informed decisions. But notice too how Abigail frames transgender arguments and people in general. In the quote I said before, she says that we are a social contagion. In fact, the very first chapter of this book is called Contagion. She repeatedly refers to transgender people and trans ideology as the transgender epidemic. Describing human beings with language likening them to disease is dehumanizing language meant to make you think that trans people are not entirely human and worth being cured or gotten rid of or eradicated. We have seen how the language of dehumanization, how describing people with, language that likens them to disease or contagions, can literally lead to things like genocide. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what people are advocating here, but that language is along those same lines. And by the way, that is to a degree what people like Abigail are arguing, even if she intends to or not. If you look at something like the transsexual empire, the idea that's stated in the transsexual empire, which is an anti-transgender book, is that the goal of trying to stop trans ideology and the transgender agenda should be to limit transgender people's access to surgeries and medical treatment, because that will help to stigmatize us and get rid of us in general in the general population.
I believe that the elimination of transsexualism is not best achieved by legislations prohibiting transsexual treatment and surgery, but rather by legislation that limits it.
It is a form of trying to eliminate transgender people within society, which, while it may not be as horrific as, trying to murder us one by one, is a form of genocide to try and weed people out of the population through things like laws and deregulation. Similarly, throughout her book, she describes transgender people in our bodies in monstrous and dehumanizing words, like when she describes a trans man as having, quote, a bulldozed version of a woman's profile. She repeatedly makes fun of transgender people. Again, it's dehumanizing language. It's making us look like less than human, something worthy of pity, scorn, or contempt. Also, look at the subtitle of the book. The transgender craze seducing our daughters. Seducing. As if transgender people are trying to sexualize young girls. Again, we get in that same fear-mongering of the bathroom bills, that transgender people are trying to sexually assault women, especially young girls. It's the same thing that used to be said about gay or lesbian or bisexual people, that our perversion was just being used to seduce young children. Think of the children. We can't have queer people around little kids because they'll be harmful to them. They'll sexualize them. They'll sexually assault them just because they're gay. It's gross and homophobic, just like something like this subtitle is transphobic. She even shares this story.
I got a call from a friend who had just taken her 13-year-old daughter for a first bra fitting at Nordstrom. It went badly, my friend said, and my mind leapt to the typical reasons, but it turned out that the problem had come in a slightly different package. A 6 feet tall, pancake makeup blurring a stubbled jaw, 2 breasts grafted onto a muscular torso like add-ons. Weeks later, I headed to the Nordstrom to confirm my friend's story. There was no mistaking that this lingerie specialist was male. What would have happened if I hadn't been there? My friend asked me.
I don't know. Probably your daughter would have gotten a bra fitting from possibly a trans woman who was paid to help and had probably helped dozens of other people every day with her own bra fittings. And by the way, if the trans woman that was going to help your daughter made you or your daughter that uncomfortable, you could have asked for a different employee to help. It's kind of a shitty thing to do to a trans woman who is an employee just trying to do her job, but it's not like retail employees aren't used to shitty customers, so do what you want to make yourself comfortable, I guess. But it's telling that for Schreier, just the mere presence of a trans person near a young girl is worrisome. There's no actual proof beyond that she's trans that this person wanted to harm this young girl, but for Abigail, it was enough. Not to mention, like I already stated, the gross language she used to describe this person who was just doing her job, or the fact that Abigail went to the store weeks later to spy on this employee. That's entirely creepy, and she admits to it in the book, that she went to a store just to spy on a trans person. How really weird is that? I bet you were expecting something pretty scary, right? That I was gonna appear in some horrifying makeup to terrify you? I mean, I guess something scarier than my face normally is. Because, you know, this whole video has had this creepy music and subtle cues to hint to you that something terrifying and scary was about to happen, even if it seemed like we were having a rational discussion this entire time. There was this underlying air of tension throughout this entire video because of little things that I did. And that's exactly what works like Abigail's book do, as well as these anti-transgender bills that we've been talking about. They pretend to be having an intellectual discussion, yet subtly clue to you that you should be expecting something scary to happen, even if the cues are meant to be not that obvious or the threat isn't even actually real. Just like this video's editing, fear-mongering is like priming you to expect a monster in the dark. But nope, it's just me, a transgender person in the bathroom, just trying to exist, trying to get our medication, trying to live our lives. So, let's turn the lights on. See? Now isn't that better? Much calmer. Feels like we can actually have a discussion. I'm not going to play any more creepy music. I promise you nothing scary is going to happen in this video other than the fact that, you know, my face is the thing. But let's wrap this discussion out and talk about why I really hate books like this, and why I hate fear-mongering, and honestly, let's just say lies, like this book espouses. Because the level of trickery that I used in this video and the type of dehumanization that I've been discussing is nigh constant throughout this book. From insulting to making fun of trans people to hyperbolicizing problems to utilizing anecdotal stories meant to hyperbolicize those issues and drawing from biased scientific sources instead of actually peer-reviewed studies. But this book is the type of ones that are used to argue for trans teens' access to medical rights to be curbed. And I don't share this book in order to straw man or straw woman the opposition. Like I said, I understand why some people may have a fear of these surgeries and why they may think that these laws are actually necessary. But the arguments used to promote those ideas by people who are actually pushing for them, that are actually putting forth these bills, are ones that are framed just like the ones in this book. Abigail herself is repeatedly cited within conservative groups, shows, organizations in order to argue for these anti-transgender laws. And the arguments she uses and the fear-mongering tactics are repeated by other writers who are arguing the same. J.K. Rowling, for example, while certainly a much better writer than Abigail and uses much less dehumanizing language, in fact much kinder language, also argues exactly the same thing as Abigail in her essay Turf Wars. And I did a whole video on that essay if you're interested in it, but it basically covers a lot of the same information that I did in this video. But I will say that J.K. Rowling probably doesn't assume as much of a directly transphobic position as Abigail does, but she expresses the same exact concerns. Yes, maybe Abigail and J.K. Rowling frame themselves differently in terms of their worry about the transgender community just existing, but they do share the similarities of very similar arguments and argumentation for specific types of laws. Now, I'm also releasing a video next month on why I think people like Abigail and J.K. Rowling argue for these anti-transgender bills, and it's a much longer conversation. But I want to be clear here that while I think this book is absolute crap and harmful, and I take issue with the bigotry that Schreier and those who like her spew, I'm not interested in attacking her or hating on her as a person. That's not my goal, because I think why many people share this kind of hatred and bigotry is because they too have fallen prey to the same type of misinformation and fear that they themselves regurgitate and peddle. A fear that is often rooted in their own trauma. But again, I'll talk about that in another video that's coming, in later this month or next month. But I just want to state right here that this book is utter crap. Its ideas are bigoted and harmful, and I think the work that Schreier and those like her have done is absolutely hateful and damaging to transgender people and especially transgender youth. But again, I'm not interested in attacking her as a person or tearing her down. That wasn't the goal of this video. It was to point out why these arguments specifically that she is sharing are harmful. What I am more interested in saying is this. I get it. I get the fear that parents may have about their child potentially going through irreversible pain and suffering due to medical transition. But let me assure you that in almost all cases, if parents work with a medical doctor who is affirming but educated on transgender issues and who follow many of the already pre-described guidelines by organizations like the WPATH, and we allow transgender teens just to have time to discover what they want and decide later on in their lives when they can consent to it and make an informed decision, that can quite literally save lives. It can save us from depression and suicide and irreversible body changes due to puberty. And so bills like the ones pushed in different governments in the United States and the UK are at best misinformed and at worst fear-mongering dehumanization and bigotry guided along by horrible books like this. And so, since I'm done here and I'm all out of toilet paper, I'm gonna have to use the next best thing. Alright everybody, thank you so much. I hope this video was informative for all of you. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more discussions on transgender topics, transgender issues, also pop and geek culture, because I'm also a giant geek and pop culture nerd, and I use geek and pop culture in order to talk about issues like this on this channel. So if any of that sounds interesting, please subscribe. I also have a Patreon page where you can help me pay the bills. Seriously, it really means a lot to me. I'm trying to get to do this full time because it takes a lot of work to do these videos, a lot of time to write and make these videos and edit these videos, and I would love and feel inspired to do this full time, so really help me out on Patreon. Does mean a lot. I'd also love to hear all of your comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about these issues because, like I said, I totally understand the very real fear that lies at the heart of this issue for many, many, many people. I totally understand it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But beyond subscribing, helping me out on Patreon, or commenting, I'm so glad that you stopped by, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Patrons, you are my patrons. You are so awesome. So here are your names. Catherine Lambeth, Eli Berg Moss, Ashley Allen, Bo Kikio, Miranda Janelle, Ashlyn Solstice, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Camille T, Randy Thompson, Stephen Schuhart, Boyd Earl, and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Rick Osborne, Roar, Ish the Mad, Piston Twisted Garage, Dominic Noble, Buttoneer, John Steele, Michael Beam, Gavin Robinson, Carmen Olson, William Stewart, Amanda Ronya, Hannah F., Nathan Olson, Andrew Jorgensen, BBD, Jason Knott, Maeve, saying it twice because I can, Andrew K., Bree Beecher, Jasmine, Nathan Steele, Skylar Gray, Lily, Tiffany Danger, Sean Piper, Wen Dizzle Bizzle, Bush, Jane Packard, Geek Filter, Mari Neckard, Jacob Tovar, Polymenia, Celestial Dawn, Jean Mithun, Sarah Bystam Din, Mark the Edge, Corey Honkinen, and Vale the Pale Dunn, Lysa, W. Randy Eady, Andrew Lamoureux, Zone 1 Librarian, and finally, Michael Hardy. I am sorry for that, but seriously, thank you so much, patrons. You really mean the world to me, and you really are changing my life, even if I may have changed your life for the worst with my singing. Thank you so much for all of your support.